this subject is a very important subject, one that we've touched on, servant or slave. These two pages have to deal with indentured servitude and slavery in the colonies. We'll start with indentured servants. As we said earlier in the chapter, indentured servants came over as a deal to pay for their trip over to America and to be taken care of for a number of years. They would work for the plantation for those years for free, and then they'd be free. And a lot of times they would get land, a little piece of land to call their own after their contract was up. The problem was is that many people did not live to see the end of their contract. They would be overworked and died. Nobody cared about what happened to these people. The owners had really no vested interest in making sure that these people, these indentured servants, were not overworked and were given proper medical care so that they could survive because they knew they were going to lose them anyway. So they were treated very poorly, and but they still needed workers. The plantation still needed workers, so that even if these people died or their contracts were up, they're still going to need more workers. So to replace those indentured servants, also another reason the indentured servitude market dried up is once people heard that this was, a very tough life, and a lot of people didn't live to see the end of their contract, they started not showing up as indentured servants anymore. So these plantations felt that they needed to move towards slavery. Now, African Americans had come over to the New World as workers, free laborers, um, but they would face a problem where either they didn't have the right religion, they were Muslim, or they had some sort of pagan religion that the Christian settlers in the New World didn't accept. So they would be relegated to second-class citizens. Um, Laws were passed to limit them as much as possible. But once the slavery trade got going, Portugal would be at the center of this. Um, they would send slaves over to the New World. A couple things that I wanted to point out about slavery was that we tend to think that slavery was only in the United States or in the colonies. That's not true at all. This is a very conservative. They're just talking about the 1700s, and even though this is a big number, 500,000 people, that's only about a tenth of the amount of slaves that were sent to the Americas themselves. They didn't quite, they would go to the Caribbean, they go to Brazil, Central America, other parts of South America, even other parts of North America. But as far as the colonies, they did not receive um, the entire amount. In fact, it was a tenth or less of the amount of slaves that were sent over. So that was something that I wanted to point out. The second thing, and this is really important that you really should understand, is the differences between an indentured servant and a slave. The indentured servant willingly became an indentured servant. The slave did not. The slave was forced into it. The indentured servant could work off their contract and no longer be an indentured servant. Slave could not. Slave was slave for life, and they had no choice to go in it, and they had no opportunity to get out of it. Um, so those are the main differences of slaves and indentured servants. And then we come to free African Americans, and free African Americans could own land. They, were paid for working, but they couldn't vote. Um, that it was still a second-class citizen. But I wanted to compare it to women because when we looked at women on the last lesson, they also could not vote. So they were similar in that respect. However, women could not own land. They couldn't. They were not given certain rights that free African American males were given. Um, in fact, free African American males were more like their white counterparts, except for the fact that they couldn't vote. And so that was the main difference, that when you're comparing free African Americans to women, What they have in common is that they couldn't vote. What they don't have in common is that free African Americans could own land and were paid for working. They could decide how to spend their money, but women could not. Women had even less rights over here. Finally, this part right here, the slave laws. This is something that really changed the face of slavery because slavery did not always take the face that it took here in America. And be surprised to know in 1641, Massachusetts was the first colony to make slavery legal, way up north. Um, we just tend to think that the South made it legal and only the South, but slavery was legal in the North for a while too. It's just that the North started abolishing slavery, as we'll see as we get closer to the Civil War, whereas the South would move in the other direction. But here's where Virginia really um, has a problem here. In 1662, it said that children born to enslaved mothers were also slaves. So not only were these people slaves for life, but now they were passing it on to their children. And that's where we get into the real heinous areas of slavery, that even their children now are slaves. They're bearing them into slavery, and that makes a big difference on um, that's a big difference in slavery in America and in other parts of the world. Not defending slavery in any stretch of the imagination anywhere, but because of that law, it made it 10 times worse that now these people cannot even have a generation of freedom, that it would be passed on from one generation to the next.